We got to get some walk-on music for this guy. Photog Steve, I asked you before we came on the air, I said, what happened in that Falls City house where the murders had occurred? And then recently, what happened in that house is, I said, is it okay to say it's unprecedented?
Yeah, unprecedented is a word I've been hearing a lot in the last few days.
Okay, so bring everybody to speed. So the 15-year-old is accused of murdering members of his family, and he's now being held. And then the defense attorneys are appointed to him. And then at a certain point, the defense team decides they go to the judge and ask the judge to be able to, they want to go into the house. Right.
That's right. So they are still working on a theory that one of the deceased siblings is actually the murderer who then repeatedly shot themselves to death after killing everybody, which doesn't line up with what the surviving victim says and doesn't appear to line up with the evidence, but that's the path they're going down. So right the week that this happened, they actually managed to get into the house for an hour, and that was with supervision, which is typical. This is still a crime scene. Even I found out that the King County Sheriff's Department, when they enter a crime scene that they control, they actually take photos before they enter and then when they leave again to maintain that continuity every day. Well, by the end of the week, they've passed it back to who's now the executor of the estate, which is the maternal grandmother, who now also has custody of the surviving sister. And at this point, she's got a cleanup crew set for Saturday in the afternoon to come up and take over the place and start getting it put back together. Saturday morning, they get word that the defense is now going to be requesting an emergency hearing to get access again. They've requested it already and were denied by the maternal grandmother. So they get word in the afternoon that now there's an official request for an emergency hearing, and the judge says, okay, I'm not going to approve your request, but we are going to have a hearing. So we're going to ice the scene. You cannot clean it. You no longer have access to it, and we'll see this early next week. The week after, they then have their hearing. And what really was interesting in this is the idea of the defense wanting more time. Okay, that's happened before. It's a big scene. This is a large house. There's a lot of evidence in there. Well, they're saying they made a unique argument that I've never heard before, and coming back to unprecedented, neither is anybody else I've talked to. They go and tell the judge that, hey, we want to go back in there, not for an hour. We want 8 a.m. to, I believe it was 6 p.m., but we also believe that we are inherently officers of the court and should not be supervised during this. Now, there are times where they don't want law enforcement hearing them if they're going to talk theory, if they're going to bounce ideas off the wall. But they're saying, no, we don't even want them in the building while we're there. We want completely unobstructed, unsupervised access. Now, asking for it's one thing. Getting it approved is another. And the judge in there, Veronica Galvin, actually signed this order and said, okay, I agree with you. You can have this, and law enforcement can't go in. So the morning of, King County Sheriff's Department does a scan of the house. They take photos of the house, and then they hand over possession. At the end of this time frame, they go back in to secure the property, and they start noticing a lot of things have changed. Because in that order, too, by the way, there were very specific provisions. They could not enter any cabinets or containers. They could only search binders and papers in plain view in the boys' room. There was no searching of the surviving victim's room at all, but they could enter into a FARO scan, which is like a 3D model for those of you in real estate, like a Matterport, but FARO's the accepted legal version. They could not look at any school paperwork, medical or legal records. They couldn't even photograph or scan those. And any items, now you would say, well, why can't they look through that stuff? There's a process. If they come in and there's a pile of book bags, let's say, and they want to see something at the bottom, they go through a process, they request it, and it will be presented to them in an evidence room that they can review. Well, as the Sheriff's Department goes in, the first thing they notice is there was a shoe outside the front door, outside of the house. It's no longer there. It's now inside the house. And they start looking through the place, and there's stuff moved all over the place. The girl's bedroom that I mentioned that they were not allowed to touch anything in not only has been entered, but there's a cabinet open, there's books moved. What was odd to me is you would think if, you know, these two attorneys that are doing this, they're not new to this. They've been doing this for about 20 years. They are public defenders by choice. They really believe in that process. They know better. And to then have gone and possibly gone and touched things and moved things is already pretty wild. To not even seemingly attempt to hide it.
Yeah, that's odd. That's odd.
And not only are things moved throughout, but then they have found there's an item missing, potentially a container of Clorox wipes. And it was in the previous photos. It's not in the after photos. So this all gets documented. Now, that was on October 28th. October 29th. So they get everything done. By November 1st, those two attorneys have withdrawn from the case, and they say there's a new attorney who's going to come in and take over. Now, that new attorney does have a private practice, that's Obsidian Law. It's not clear how, I don't know that it'll ever be disclosed, but there's no way that this young man can pay for legal help, and he's certainly not going to get help from the family.
Yeah.
So she may be taking this pro bono or whatnot, but it is switching to a very different type of attorney. So they pull back, and by the November 5th, the King County prosecutors are now filing a motion to compel discovery. What they're saying is, not only do you need to give us every single thing you found, every photo you took, every scan you took, including your handwritten notes from the 29th, we also want it from the 23rd because you've made such a mess of this thing now.
Yeah. We
want it all. They outline that there's significant alteration to the scene as well as the missing items. And so, when I heard this, I'm thinking, well, what even is the consequence to this? This is so over the top. And so I contacted the King County Prosecutor's Office. They were kind of dumbfounded too. They knew about it. They weren't surprised when I called, but they said, we don't really know what comes next. And so I started talking to others in the legal community. I reached out to Ann Bremner, who many of you may be familiar with, seen her on
Sure.
TV. She talks on, adds to a lot of this stuff. I met with her today. She even went on camera. She said that she doesn't really know what happens next, but this is a big deal. There could be sanctions. There's attorneys I've talked to said you could be disbarred for this.
Yeah.
There's also the thought of, well, why? Where's the logic in all of this? Anne alluded to on camera, so I'm only speaking about things she's talked about in public, is she thinks that there's a chance they maybe inadvertently became witnesses and didn't expect that, and then felt like, well, now we become witness. Witness is kind of a broad term for they found something that precludes them from being able to do their job effectively, or they know things that they shouldn't at this point. For people at home who think let's say you, and I'm not saying he did or did not commit a crime, but let's say you did and you get an attorney. You don't just tell your attorney, yeah, I did it. That doesn't work that way. It's very careful how that relationship works. And if your attorney then does find out evidence that leads them to believe you did do it, it gets complicated. You could potentially become a witness.
I see.
So it's not clear through that. Could they end up coming back later with what they know through this new attorney, or what happens yet? And so, we have Judge Veronica Galvin. And so this judge is known out here. She handles a lot of juvenile cases. She's a juvenile court judge. And early on in this, she put together an order that the media not release his identity. Now, it's not uncommon that the media doesn't release juveniles' identity. That's nothing new. But to have an order is somewhat odd, especially now that it's been publicly released. So generally, what that means, like if I reach out to the King County Prosecutor's Office and I want documents on any case, once they release it to me, it is now publicly disclosable. They'd already released all of this. It's out in documents, and we're not allowed to say the name. That's an odd order. And the general consensus across the media—
She doesn't need to explain why she's making this order.
No, she just said, well, she said, this is juvenile court. This is how we handle it in juvenile court. The records don't show that. The record shows how it's being handled now, but that's not how it's just generally handled.
So because her experience, and she's done this for a while, you can see that this is an unusual move on her case. Or she hasn't done this before, where he orders that the name cannot be released.
That's right. And so, and that's why I say it's not uncommon for the media to hold back, but the general consensus now is the media is waiting for one organization to, whether accidentally or intentionally, put the name out, and then everybody's going to be putting the name out. Nobody wants to be first and lose their court privileges. And that same week that the main hearing happened was the same week that the Daily Mail is accused of sending in, somebody posing as somebody else to try and get access to the daughter. A lot of wild things are happening out there. And then there's a lot of us who are really trying to just do this right. And to get an order like that makes it very complicated.
So let me just sort of follow along the steps. So somebody goes in and photographs a whole bunch of stuff inside the house, and that's number one, right? And then at that point, they then step out of the house, and then they let them in, or is there time that passed between? Because can they say, we didn't do it, somebody else broke into the house and did all this? I assume the house is surrounded, and is it secured in some way that no one else is able to get in there?
So I haven't seen the photos and the date stamp, but what I'm told is they photographed it that morning. They kept control of the house. They did keep somebody there now. That doesn't mean an argument can't still be made. You find a hole in the fence. It's a large estate.
Got it. Yeah.
But from a practical standpoint, it was monitored.
I talked to a friend of mine who's a former prosecutor. He said there was silence on the other end of the phone. He said, I can't understand why somebody would do this, and possibly, as you mentioned, to be disbarred, these two attorneys. You're still on this. You follow up on this one as well. I have to tell you something. If you want to, people left, right, news bias, all this stuff, you want to get like great local news. I don't know how you're in so many places all at the same time, but people can follow you at
Photog Steve 81 on every platform.
There you go.